Hello everyone, I'm really glad you're here. Tonight, I want to help you let go of the day and ease into rest. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, and it means a lot to be part of your nightly routine. So, if you haven't already, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It truly helps. Now, settle in, close your eyes, and let's begin. Story 1. It was late in the afternoon, and the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the quiet highway as I pulled into a rest stop. The road had been empty for miles, a vast stretch of asphalt cutting through a barren and desolate landscape. The rest stop was a small oasis amidst the emptiness, with a few picnic tables, vending machines humming softly, and a restroom facility that seemed worn yet oddly comforting. I parked my car under the shade of a scraggly tree and stepped out, stretching my legs and breathing in the cool breeze that offered welcome relief from the heat of the day. For a moment, I closed my eyes and simply listened to the sound of the wind whispering through the nearby grass. It felt good to pause, to let the stillness wash over me, even as a faint unease stirred in the back of my mind. The place was too quiet, almost unnaturally so, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Deciding I could use a drink, I wandered over to the vending machines, scanning the worn buttons and dimly glowing display. As I fished in my pocket for some coins, I caught sight of a figure approaching from the opposite side of the rest area. He was tall, with a scruffy beard and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. His stride was steady, purposeful, yet something about him unsettled me in a way I couldn't explain. I tried to shake the feeling as he raised a hand in greeting, his voice carrying across the still air. "Excuse me, miss, can you help me with something?" he called out. My hand hesitated over the button on the vending machine as I turned slightly to face him. "Sure, what do you need?" I replied, keeping my tone light even as a subtle tension crept into my chest. Pulling out my phone, I squinted at the weak signal and tried to bring up a map. "I think the nearest town is about 15 miles east," I said, pointing down the highway. "You should see signs for it along the way." He stepped closer, and I noticed the way his eyes seemed to narrow slightly as they studied me. "You traveling alone?" he asked, his tone light, but carrying an undertone that made me uneasy. A prickle of instinct warned me to be careful. "No," I lied smoothly, my heart quickening. "I'm meeting some friends down the road. We're on a road trip together." His gaze lingered on me for a fraction too long, the weight of it pressing against my composure like an invisible hand. I forced a small laugh, keeping my body language as relaxed as I could manage. "Yeah, well, I've done a lot of trips like this. I'm used to it." The man's presence felt heavier with every passing moment, his questions inching closer to personal territory. "Where are you headed to?" he asked, his voice losing its casual lilt and gaining an edge of insistence. "Just exploring some national parks," I replied vaguely, hoping the deliberate lack of detail would steer him away from prying further. His eyes narrowed slightly as he studied me, and I caught a faint glimmer of something calculating in his expression. "Yes," I said firmly, letting my voice take on an edge of confidence I didn't entirely feel. "They're expecting me. My husband's a cop. If I don't check in soon, he'll come looking for me." For a brief moment, something flickered across the man's face. Uncertainty, hesitation, perhaps even fear. He stepped back slightly, his gaze darting around the rest stop as if weighing his next move. "Well, I'd better let you get on your way then," he said, his tone abruptly lighter. "We want to keep you from your trip." I gave a small, tight smile, nodding. "Yeah, I should get going." "Good luck finding your way." Once inside my car, I locked the doors and started the engine, my hands trembling as I gripped the steering wheel. I took a steadying breath, forcing myself to focus as I pulled back onto the highway. For miles, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the man's car trailing behind me. But the road remained empty, nothing but the soft orange glow of the setting sun stretching across the horizon. Gradually, my breathing slowed, and the tightness in my chest began to ease. though the unease lingered like a shadow clinging to the edge of my mind. An hour later, I pulled into a larger, more populated rest stop, its parking lot bustling with families and truckers alike. Here, I finally felt safe enough to park and take a few deep breaths. I called a friend, my voice unsteady as I recounted what had happened. Hearing her calm, familiar tone helped soothe my frayed nerves, and I realized just how close I might have come to a dangerous situation. The man's invasive questions and unsettling demeanor echoed in my thoughts like ripples on still water. From that day forward, I promised myself to listen more closely to that quiet voice of instinct, the one that whispers warnings when logic tries to wave them away. The open roads still called to me, its vastness and freedom irresistible in their allure. But I approached it now with a new awareness, the quiet wariness that reminded me of the fragility of safety. The world was vast and beautiful, yes, but it was also unpredictable, filled with hidden dangers that could emerge from the calmest of places. As the miles rolled by beneath my tires and the sky deepened into twilight, I resolved to remain vigilant, to listen to that inner voice that guides us through the shadows and back into the light. Story 2. The remote cabin nestled deep in the heart of the woods was meant to be a refuge, a quiet retreat from the relentless pace of city life. Surrounded by towering pines and a blanket of stars, it promised solitude and tranquility, and escape from the constant hum of urban existence. The drive to the cabin had been uneventful, though the winding roads grew narrower as the miles passed, giving way to rugged trails that tested the limits of my SUV. By the time I arrived, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows that danced eerily in the glow of my headlights. I unpacked my belongings with care, savoring the silence that wrapped around the secluded hideaway like an embrace. The air felt heavy with the scent of pine and earth, and for a moment I closed my eyes to breathe it all in, letting the weight of the city fade into memory. That first night passed without incident. I spent the evening curled up by the fireplace, the crackling flames casting a warm glow against the rustic wooden walls. The sound of the wind whispering through the trees outside became a soothing melody, and as the fire dwindled to embers, I retired to the small bedroom, slipping under the heavy quilt. The bed creaked softly as I settled in, the distant hoot of an owl carrying through the stillness of the night. Sleep came quickly, deep and dreamless, the kind of rest only found in places far removed from the world's demands. The cabin, in those hours, felt like a protective cocoon, shielding me from everything beyond its wooden walls. The following day was spent exploring the surrounding forest, wandering along narrow trails that wound through dense undergrowth and skirted the edges of crystal-clear streams. The air was crisp and invigorating, filled with the rich scent of pine needles and damp earth. Rays of sunlight filtered through the canopy, casting shifting patterns on the forest floor as I walked. Time seemed to slow in those woods, each step quiet and deliberate, as if the world outside no longer existed. By the time I returned to the cabin, the sky had deepened into twilight, painted in hues of deep blue and soft purple, with stars beginning to pierce the gathering darkness. Exhausted from the day's adventures, I ate a simple meal and settled into bed early, letting the natural sounds of the forest lull me into another deep slumber. But that peaceful night was broken. At precisely 3:00 a.m., I awoke with a start to the sound of loud, insistent knocking on the door. My breath caught in my throat as I froze, heart pounding so fiercely I thought it might burst. The knocking came again, 3 sharp raps that echoed through the small cabin, reverberating off the wooden walls like a drumbeat. I sat up in bed, straining to listen, and grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand. The cabin was still otherwise, save for the faint creak of settling timbers and the rustle of leaves in the night breeze. The knocking continued, steady and deliberate, as if someone or something was demanding to be let in. I slipped quietly out of bed, every sense on high alert, and crept toward the door. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. "Who's there?" There was no answer, only the relentless pounding that seemed to grow louder with each passing moment. Summoning what courage I could muster, I peered through the peephole. Darkness stared back at me, an impenetrable void broken only by the faint outline of trees swaying in the wind. No figure stood on the porch, no shadowy form moved in the moonlight. My hand trembled as I reached for the lock, hesitating, then slowly unlatched the door and cracked it open. A rush of cold air swept in, sending a shiver down my spine as I stepped onto the porch, sweeping the flashlight's beam across the empty clearing. "Is anyone there?" I called again, louder this time, my voice shaking. Silence was my only answer. The forest seemed to hold its breath. An unease settled over me like a heavy fog. I scanned the tree line once more, before retreating back into the cabin, closing and locking the door with trembling hands. I checked every window, ensuring each was secured, and drew the curtains tight against the night. My mind raced. Had it been an animal? A trick of the wind? Or was someone playing a cruel joke, knowing how isolated this place was? Sleep eluded me for the rest of the night as I lay in bed, straining to hear any sound beyond the cabin walls. The knocking did not return, but its echo lingered in my thoughts like a shadow that would not lift. When dawn finally broke, pale light spilling through the curtains, I felt a fragile sense of relief. The day seemed to banish the fears of the night, though a quiet unease still clung to me. I forced myself to go about my plans, venturing back into the woods, but found my attention constantly pulled to every sound, every shifting shadow. The forest's calm had been replaced with an edge of tension, and I could not shake the memory of the knocking. It gnawed at me, an unresolved mystery that demanded explanation yet offered none. As evening approached, I steeled myself against the growing dread and resolved to confront whatever was happening. On my final night at the cabin, I set up a camera on the porch, aimed squarely at the door, hoping to capture proof of the nocturnal visitor. As the clock crept closer to 3, "Oh, clock a him!" I lay in bed, every muscle taut, waiting for the knocking to return. And it did, right on cue. The loud, insistent rapping echoed once more through the cabin, rattling the wooden walls. My heart thundered as I stared at the door, the sound relentless and unnerving. Fumbling with my phone, I checked the camera feed, expecting to see a figure. But the porch was empty. The camera captured nothing but stillness. The door unmoving as the knocking persisted. Desperation and frustration surged through me. I grabbed the flashlight and stormed to the door, flinging it open with more force than intended. The knocking ceased instantly, leaving only the whisper of the wind and the pounding of my own heart. The forest stood silent and unmoving, indifferent to my fear. I shouted into the darkness, demanding answers from the unseen force tormenting me, but the only response was the rustle of leaves and the distant call of an owl. Defeated, I returned to the cabin, bolting the door behind me. Exhaustion eventually overcame my fear, and I drifted into a restless sleep, haunted by the unanswered questions. When I left the cabin the next morning, the memory of the knocking clung to me like a shadow. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was leaving something behind, an unseen presence, a question forever unresolved. As I drove away, the forest receded into the distance, its secrets concealed once more beneath its canopy of green. The experience had left its mark, a chilling reminder that some mysteries are never meant to be solved, and some encounters with the unknown linger long after the danger has passed. The world is filled with places where silence speaks louder than words, and sometimes what we don't see is more terrifying than anything we could imagine. Story 3. Living alone in a small apartment in the heart of the city had its charms. It was my sanctuary, a cozy space where I could retreat from the chaos of the outside world and lose myself in the quiet comforts of solitude. The apartment sat on the 4th floor of an aging building, tucked away in a peaceful corner with large windows that let in streams of natural light during the day. At night, the gentle hum of the city below became a lulling backdrop, a reminder of life moving on outside even as I closed the door behind me. For months, I had felt safe here, as though nothing could disturb the sense of control and routine I had cultivated. But one night, everything changed, and the fragile sense of security I had taken for granted cracked like glass under pressure. It had been a particularly long day at work, the kind that left my mind foggy and my body yearning for rest. By 10 p.m., I was already curled up in bed, the sheets cool against my skin and the faint breeze from the open window whispering across the room. The familiar sounds of the city drifted up to my ears, a car passing below, a distant siren, the muffled laughter of people enjoying the night. Slowly, I began to relax, my thoughts drifting as sleep pulled me into its embrace. It was almost peaceful until the feeling came. A strange, subtle shift in the air jolted me from slumber. It wasn't a noise or a touch, but an unshakable instinct that something wasn't right. My eyes fluttered open, adjusting to the dim light filtering through the curtains. And that's when I saw him. A man stood at the foot of my bed. For a moment I thought I was dreaming, my mind unable to process the sight before me. He was tall, his figure shadowy and indistinct in the faint glow of the city lights outside. My breath caught in my throat, heart hammering as terror shot through me like lightning. The world seemed to narrow to the space between us, silence pressing in so tightly it felt suffocating. Then, instinct took over. I screamed, the sound tearing through the stillness like shattered glass. The man jerked back, startled, and bolted toward the doorway. I heard the hurried thud of his footsteps retreating down the hall and the slam of the front door as it closed behind him. My body shook as I scrambled out of bed, my legs unsteady beneath me. I rushed to the door, fumbling with the lock and securing it with trembling hands. Every nerve in my body screamed for action, but my mind was a whirlwind of questions. How had he gotten in? Who was he? My breath came in ragged gasps as I backed away from the door, clutching my phone with slippery fingers. Somehow I managed to dial 911, my voice cracking as I explained what had happened to the calm voice on the other end. The dispatcher assured me that officers were on their way and instructed me to stay on the line until they arrived. I huddled in the corner of the living room, staring at the locked door as if my fear alone could keep the intruder out. Every creak of the old apartment felt amplified, every shifting shadow a threat. Minutes felt like hours, but finally flashing lights illuminated the windows and a firm knock on the door announced the arrival of the police. My heart surged with relief as I opened the door to the reassuring sight of two uniformed officers. Their presence felt like a barrier between me and the darkness that had invaded my home. I recounted the events, my voice steadier now as they listened and asked questions. They searched the apartment, checking every window and lock, but found no signs of forced entry. It was as though the man had melted into the night, leaving only the memory of his presence behind. The officers suggested I call someone to stay with me for the night. I nodded, grateful for their concern, and as soon as they left I called my best friend Megan. She arrived within minutes, her arms wrapping around me in a comforting embrace that steadied my frayed nerves. We sat together in the soft glow of the kitchen light, drinking tea and talking in hushed voices. As the night wore on, my panic began to ebb, replaced by an overwhelming fatigue that finally allowed me to rest. Megan stayed the night, her presence anchoring me in the aftermath of the fear that had stolen my peace. Over the next few days I took every precaution I could think of. New locks were installed, and a security system was set up. I even added motion sensor lights outside the apartment building. Each small measure brought a fragment of peace, but the memory of that night lingered like a stain I couldn't scrub away. I spoke to my neighbors, alerting them to what had happened, and they responded with shock and concern. Some offered to keep an eye out, and while their support was comforting, it didn't erase the sense of violation that clung to me like a second skin. The police continued their investigation, but no leads emerged. The man who had stood silently at the foot of my bed remained a phantom in my mind, his intentions an identity an unsolvable enigma. I found myself replaying the scene over and over, searching for details I might have missed, wondering if there had been something I could have done differently, Sleep became elusive in the nights that followed, and when it came, it brought with it unsettling dreams that left me waking in a cold sweat. Gradually, life began to return to normal, though it was a different kind of normal than before. I was more cautious now, more alert to the world around me. Where once I had felt carefree in my little apartment, I now checked every lock twice, listened intently to every sound, and avoided letting my guard down. But I refused to let fear control my life completely. The intruder had taken my sense of safety, but I would not let him take my independence. This was still my home, and I would reclaim it, piece by piece. Every evening, as I locked the door and set the alarm, I reminded myself that I was stronger than the fear that had once paralyzed me. The city outside hummed with life, its constant motion a reminder that I was part of something larger, something resilient. In time, my apartment felt like a sanctuary again, a place of calm and quiet where I could breathe deeply and let my guard down, if only for a little while. But a part of me would always remain vigilant, a quiet watchfulness born from the night. A stranger stood where no one ever should have been. Story 4. The road trip had started as a way to clear my mind, a spontaneous escape from the routines and obligations that had been weighing heavily on me. I planned my route carefully, weaving through scenic byways and small towns that promised charm and quiet reprieve. The journey had been pleasant so far, filled with rolling hills, stretches of dense forests, and quaint little stops where time seemed to slow down. On the third day, I found myself in a town that felt frozen in another era, its streets lined with aging storefronts and faded signs. As noon approached, my stomach reminded me that I hadn't eaten since breakfast, and the sight of a small diner with neon lights felt like a beacon calling me to rest. The diner was nearly empty when I stepped inside, its air heavy with the comforting scent of coffee and frying bacon. The waitress, a kind woman with a warm smile, welcomed me and handed me a menu. I ordered a classic cheeseburger with fries and a steaming cup of coffee, happy for the simplicity. As I waited, I struck up a casual conversation with the cook, who spoke fondly of the town's history and the characters who had passed through over the years. Their voices were soothing, and for the first time in days, I felt the tightness in my chest ease. The meal arrived quickly and I ate with enthusiasm, the burger juicy and the fries golden and crisp, just the way I like them. As I pushed my empty plates aside, I noticed a small folded piece of paper tucked underneath it. Frowning, I picked it up, curiosity sparking as I unfolded the creased note. The words, scrawled in hurried handwriting, sent a chill racing down my spine. "Don't look back." I stared at the message, my heart beginning to pound. At first, I thought it must be a prank, but the unease that settled over me was too heavy to dismiss. Who had left this note? And why? I glanced round the diner, but the other patrons were absorbed in their conversations, their faces unreadable. I left a generous tip on the table and hurried out to my car, the bright sunlight doing little to dispel the anxiety that now clung to me. As I started the engine and pulled onto the road, the words of the note echoed in my mind like an incantation. Don't look back. The empty highway stretched ahead, inviting and endless. Yet every so often, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end, as though unseen eyes were watching me. I checked the rearview mirror compulsively, expecting to catch sight of a car following me, but each time there was nothing. Just the ribbon of asphalt unspooling behind me and the occasional flash of trees. Hours passed in a blur. The landscape shifted from rural countryside to the beginnings of suburban sprawl, yet the unease did not fade. The sun slipped below the horizon, and as darkness fell, every shadow seemed to deepen into something more ominous. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles pale under the dashboard light. I turned on the radio in search of comfort, but even the cheerful tunes seemed to carry an undercurrent of something sinister, and the static between stations sounded almost like whispers. A sign for a rest stop appeared, and I decided to pull over, hoping that stepping out of the car might help shake the heavy dread that clung to me. The lot was empty, the restrooms locked for the night, and a single street lamp flickered overhead, casting an eerie circle of light. I stretched my legs, the cool night air prickling my skin as I glanced around. The stillness was unsettling, broken only by the faint hum of the distant highway. As I stood there, I felt a sudden prickle at the base of my neck, a sharp, instinctive warning. My breath caught as I turned quickly, scanning the shadows, but saw nothing. I didn't linger. Sliding back into the driver's seat, I locked the doors and started the car, the engine's low rumble somehow comforting against the thick silence outside. As I pulled back onto the road, I fought the compulsion to glance behind me, to check the rearview mirror again. The memory of the note pressed into my thoughts like a weight. Don't look back. The road ahead was all that mattered, I told myself, forcing my focus forward even as tension coiled tightly in my chest. By the time I reached my driveway, I was exhausted. The lights of home should have brought relief, but instead I felt a strange reluctance to leave the car. When I finally stepped out and locked the door behind me, the quiet of the neighborhood felt oppressive rather than peaceful. Inside, the house was still and familiar, but my nerves were too frayed to relax. Sleep would not come easily that night. Every creak of the house, every rustle of wind outside the window kept me on edge, the words from the diner looping endlessly in my mind. Don't look back. In the days that followed, the experience became like a splinter lodged deep in my thoughts. I never learned who had left the note or why. The logical part of me wanted to dismiss it as a strange coincidence or someone's misguided attempt at humor. But a quieter, deeper part of me wondered if it had been something else. A warning I'd narrowly heeded, sparing me from a danger I would never know, and so I remained cautious, more watchful on the road, a little slower to dismiss the small voices of instinct. The memory of the note, cryptic and chilling, lingered like a faint whisper in the back of my mind, reminding me that sometimes the most important thing you can do is keep moving forward and never, ever look back. Story 5. The graveyard shift at the convenience store had always been a monotonous routine, a quiet stretch of hours where time seemed to slow to a crawl. Most nights passed uneventfully, marked only by the occasional customer shuffling in for cigarettes or a late-night snack and the low hum of the refrigeration units in the background. The store's fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting a sterile glow that reflected off the linoleum floors and rows of neatly stacked shelves. It was a rhythm I had come to know well, a slow, predictable lull that allowed me to drift into thought as I restocked snacks and brewed stale coffee. But there are nights when even the most ordinary places seem to shift subtly, and an invisible tension coils in the air like something unseen is watching. This night began like all the others. I had just finished arranging a display of candy bars when the chime above the door rang out, sharp and sudden in the stillness. I glanced up and saw a man step inside. He was tall and thin, dressed in a dark coat and a wide-brimmed hat that cast a shadow over his face. Something about him made me pause. There was no smile, no nod of acknowledgement, just a silent presence that seemed to carry its own gravity. I swallowed the unease rising in my chest and forced a cheerful tone into my voice. "Good evening," I called out. But the man didn't respond. He simply drifted down the aisle, his movements slow and deliberate, almost as if he were gliding rather than walking. For a few minutes, I watched from behind the counter as he moved through the store. Every so often I would glance down at the register or busy myself with some minor task, but my eyes always returned to the spot where he had last been. It was hard to shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Then, as quietly as he had arrived, he seemed to vanish. One moment he was there, turning down an aisle. The next, the space was empty, and the faint sound of his footsteps had ceased. I blinked in surprise and waited for the chime of the door to signal his departure, but it never came. My stomach tightened as I stood and scanned the store. The aisle stretched out, perfectly still under the harsh fluorescent lights. I walked slowly toward the back, my shoes squeaking softly against the floor. "Sir?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. There was no reply. Heart pounding now, I checked each row. expecting at any moment to see him standing silently in the shadows. But the store was empty. With a shaky breath, I returned to the counter, telling myself that he must have left without me noticing. Out of habit, I glanced at the security monitors mounted above the counter, their screens flickering with grainy footage of the store. I rewound the feed to the moment he entered, watching his tall frame glide through the door. He moved slowly, deliberately, and then he disappeared. 1 second he was rounding a corner, and the next there was nothing. No sign of him exiting, no trace of movement. I froze, replaying the footage again and again, my hands clammy against the counter. There was no glitch, no indication of a camera error. The man had simply ceased to exist on the screen. A cold prickle ran down my spine as I scanned the store one more time, eyes darting to the corners where shadows seemed to linger just a little too long. I told myself I was imagining things, that fatigue was playing tricks on my mind. Still, I couldn't shake the sensation that I wasn't alone, that unseen eyes were watching me from somewhere just beyond the reach of the light. Every creak of the store shelves, every faint buzz of the lights felt louder now, like whispers pressing against my ears. As the hours dragged on, I found myself glancing nervously at the door, half expecting it to swing open again to reveal that shadowy figure. Around 4 a.m. the chime rang, and I startled so violently that I nearly knocked over a cup of coffee. Relief flooded through me when I saw a familiar face, a regular customer, an elderly man who lived nearby. He shuffled in, smiling faintly as he approached the counter for his usual pack of cigarettes and morning newspaper. "Quiet night?" he asked, his voice rough but kind. "You could say that," I replied, forcing a smile as I rang up his items. "Have you ever noticed anything strange around here?" "Strange? Like what?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. I hesitated, unsure how to explain without sounding unhinged. "Just odd things. People coming and going without me noticing, that sort of thing." The old man chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Sounds like the graveyard shift is getting to you. This place can play tricks on your mind when you're all alone." I nodded, laughing weakly as he took his bag and left. The store fell silent again, but now the silence felt heavier, more oppressive, like a thick fog pressing against the windows. When dawn finally crept across the horizon, the first light of day spilling into the store, I felt a wave of relief so intense it nearly brought tears to my eyes. I gathered my belongings quickly, eager to leave the sterile glow of the store behind. As I locked up and stepped outside, I glanced back one last time, the memory of the vanishing man lingering like a shadow in my thoughts. Over the following weeks I returned to my shifts, but the sense of ease I once had was gone. Every night, I caught myself scanning the security monitors, waiting for the flicker of movement in the corner of my eye. The man never returned, but his absence was almost worse. It left me wondering if he had ever been there at all, or if something far stranger had brushed against my world that night, something that had no intention of being understood. Story 6. The old building had stood for decades, its weathered facade and boarded-up windows a silent testament to a bygone era. It loomed on the edge of town like a relic left behind, its crumbling brickwork and sagging roof giving it the eerie air of a place long forgotten. It was a warm Saturday afternoon when my friends and I decided to explore it. We had always been drawn to the mysterious, to the forgotten corners of the world that whispered secrets through rust and decay. For months, we had talked about this building, speculating about its history and the stories hidden within its walls. Today, curiosity finally outweighed caution. Jake, Lily and I set out with flashlights, cameras and backpacks stuffed with water and snacks. As we approached the building, it seemed to grow taller, its silent presence both inviting and menacing. A cool breeze stirred the tall grass around its foundation, carrying with it the faint smell of dust and old wood. "Are you sure about this?" Lily asked, her voice tinged with excitement and unease. "What's the worst that could happen?" Jake grinned, trying to sound braver than he looked. I nodded, keeping my own apprehension buried. We've talked about this for months. Let's do it. The entrance was partially blocked by debris, but we managed to squeeze through a narrow gap in the boards. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay. Sunlight streamed through cracks in the walls, casting long, slanted beams that illuminated floating dust particles like tiny ghosts. The floor creaked under our weight as we stepped cautiously through the first room, our flashlights cutting through the dimness. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, and broken furniture lay scattered like forgotten memories. Each room we entered felt heavy, as though the building itself was watching us intrude upon its solitude. At first, the exploration felt like an adventure. We took photos, marveling at the eerie beauty of the derelict structure. Faded paintings still clung to the walls, their subjects obscured by grime and time. An old piano sat in the corner of what appeared to be a common room, its keys yellowed and warped, yet strangely intact. Lily brushed her fingers over them gently, and a single, haunting note echoed through the empty halls. But then we saw something that shifted the air around us, a sleeping bag neatly rolled in the corner, next to a small pile of canned food and an empty water bottle. A worn-out backpack leaned against the wall, and nearby, a makeshift fire pit with cold ashes suggested recent use. A chill ran down my spine. "Someone's been here," I whispered, pointing to the setup. Jake's grin faltered, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. "Do you think they're still here?" Lily asked, her voice barely above a breath. "We should be careful," Jake muttered, his usual bravado replaced with caution. The mood shifted. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant sound of wind rattling through broken windows made our hearts jump. We continued deeper into the building, our earlier excitement dulled by a growing sense of unease. As we moved through the rooms, we found more signs of habitation. An old jacket draped over a chair, a flashlight with fresh batteries, and footprints in the dust that weren't ours. The realization that we might not be alone tightened my chest. My senses felt heightened, alert for any sign of movement in the dim hallways. "Maybe we should leave," Lily whispered, her hand clutching my arm. "Yeah," I agreed softly, scanning the shadow. "Let's get out of here before—" Footsteps echoed behind us. We froze, staring at each other, our expressions mirroring the fear that surged through us. The sound was faint at first but grew louder, deliberate, as if someone or something was walking toward us. "Run!" Jake hissed, and we didn't hesitate. Our footsteps pounded in sync with the approaching ones as we bolted down the hallway, flashlights bouncing wildly in our hands. The building seemed to stretch endlessly, every doorway and corridor blurring into one long nightmare. Ahead, we saw the faint glow of daylight seeping through the gap where we had entered. Bursting through the boards, we stumbled into the open air, gasping and wide-eyed. We didn't stop running until we were a good distance away, collapsing onto the grass, our chests heaving. The building loomed silently behind us, its cracked windows staring down like empty eyes. "Did you see who it was?" Lily asked, her voice shaking. "No," Jake admitted, his face pale, "but someone was following us." We agreed to report what we'd found to the local authorities. They promised to investigate, but we never heard anything more about it. The building remained abandoned, its secrets locked away within those crumbling walls. The experience became a cautionary tale among our friends, a reminder of the unseen dangers lurking in forgotten places. We had gone searching for adventure, and though we found it, we also found something else, something that made us realize not every mystery is meant to be solved. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can hear those footsteps echoing in the silence. Whoever or whatever had been in that building with us that day is a question that will never leave my mind, and a part of me wonders if they are still there, waiting for the next group of curious explorers to wander into their domain. Story 7. It was a quiet evening when I decided to take the long route home. The winding back roads had always brought me a sense of peace. The way they curved gently through thick woods and open fields, far from the chaos of the main highways. As twilight settled over the landscape, The world seemed bathed in a soft, golden glow, and I rolled down the windows to let in the cool night air. The gentle hum of my tires against the asphalt and the distant chorus of crickets created a soothing soundtrack, lulling me into a comfortable calm. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and darkness crept in, the road seemed to change. The air grew heavier, the shadows deeper, and I felt a subtle unease stir in the pit of my stomach. The stretch of road ahead was unfamiliar, though I could have sworn I'd driven this way before. The trees on either side loomed taller, their branches arching overhead to form a canopy that blocked out the last traces of fading light. My headlights cut a narrow path through the darkness, illuminating only what lay immediately ahead. For miles I didn't see another car, not even the faint glow of distant taillights. It was as if the world beyond my vehicle had fallen away, leaving me alone in a tunnel of silence. Then, in the corner of my vision, something moved. A shadow darted between the trees on the left side of the road. I gripped the steering wheel tighter and leaned forward, eyes scanning the roadside for deer or some other animal. But there was nothing, only the dark forest, still and silent. I shook my head, trying to dismiss it as a trick of the light or my tired mind playing games. But the uneasy feeling didn't fade. A few minutes later, I saw it again. This time the shape was clearer, tall and humanoid, stepping lightly between the trees. My breath caught as I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure emerge onto the road behind me, but the pavement stretched empty in both directions. I pressed harder on the gas, eager to put more distance between myself and whatever I thought I'd seen. The car's engine hummed steadily, but the sound felt too loud, too sharp against the oppressive silence outside. The road seemed endless now. I checked my phone, hoping to pull up a map, but the screen showed only a spinning icon and the words, "No service." A chill ran down my spine as I realized how isolated I truly was. Then, just ahead, my headlight swept across a wooden sign, its paint chipped and faded. It read, "Dead Man's Hollow, next right." I didn't remember ever hearing of such a place, and yet something about the name sent a shiver through me. Against my better judgment, I kept driving. Not long after passing the sign, I saw a person standing at the edge of the road. They were dressed in pale clothing, their head tilted slightly as if listening. My foot instinctively eased off the gas as I squinted through the windshield, but when the headlights fully illuminated the spot, there was no one there. My heart pounded in my chest as I scanned the roadside, wondering how they could have vanished so quickly. A few miles later, my car's dashboard lights flickered. The radio, which had been playing soft static, cut out abruptly. For a heartbeat, the vehicle seemed to lose power, the headlights dimming before surging back to life. My hands trembled on the wheel as I whispered a quiet plea for the car to hold on. The last thing I wanted was to be stranded out here, alone and vulnerable in the dark. That's when I heard it. The sound of footsteps running alongside the car. My breath caught as I risked a glance out the driver's side window. In the faint glow of the passing trees, I saw a figure keeping pace with me, its limbs moving unnaturally fast, its face obscured by shadow. My instinct screamed at me to keep my eyes on the road, to focus forward and not acknowledge it. But my curiosity betrayed me, and in the next moment I looked again. The figure was gone. When I finally saw the welcoming glow of streetlights in the distance, relief surged through me like a wave. As I pulled back onto familiar roads and into the safety of my neighborhood, the tension in my body began to unwind. But even as I parked in my driveway and stepped into the warm light of my home, the memory lingered like a shadow at the edge of my thoughts. That night, I dreamed of running footsteps and a pale figure watching from the trees, and when I woke, I couldn't shake the feeling that some part of me had been left behind on that road, trapped in the darkness with whatever it was that had followed me. Story 8. It was supposed to be a fun weekend getaway, a chance to unwind with friends in a secluded cabin tucked deep in the mountains. We had all been craving a break from our busy lives, and the idea of disconnecting from the world for a few days seemed perfect. The cabin was charming, surrounded by towering pines and overlooking a serene lake that reflected the sky like a mirror. The air smelled crisp and clean, and for the first day everything felt idyllic. We spent hours laughing, cooking meals together and exploring the nearby trails. But as night fell, an unease began to creep into the edges of my thoughts, subtle at first, like a faint chill in the air. The first strange thing happened around midnight. We were sitting by the fireplace telling stories when we heard footsteps on the porch. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, as if someone was circling the cabin. We all froze, exchanging uneasy glances. "Probably just an animal," Sarah whispered, though her voice lacked conviction. Jake, ever the brave one, grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside to check. We followed close behind, staying within the warm glow spilling out from the doorway, but the porch was empty. The surrounding woods were still, too still, and the only sound was the distant rustle of wind through the trees. There were no footprints in the thin layer of dirt on the porch. Trying to shake off the tension, we returned inside and bolted the door. But the mood had shifted. The laughter faded, replaced by long stretches of silence as we listened intently for any sound outside. When we finally decided to head to bed, I couldn't help but feel like we were being watched. I pulled the curtains tight and buried myself under the covers, but sleep came fitfully, my mind replaying the sound of those slow, heavy footsteps again and again. The next morning, we tried to dismiss the previous night's events. Maybe it had been our imaginations, heightened by the isolation and the eerie atmosphere of the woods. We spent the day hiking and swimming in the lake, and by evening we were tired enough that the fear seemed almost laughable. That night we played board games and turned in earlier, determined to sleep soundly. But sometime in the deep hours of the night, I woke to a faint tapping on the window beside my bed. I froze, my breath caught in my throat, and listened. The sound came again. Tap, 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 tap. Light, like fingernails brushing against the glass. Slowly I turned my head toward the window, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure it would wake the others. In the dim moonlight I could make out a shadowy figure standing just outside. I couldn't see its face, but I felt its eyes on me. A cold, suffocating presence pressing in from the other side of the glass. I wanted to scream, to run, but fear held me still. Then, without warning, the figure stepped back and melted into the darkness. The tapping ceased. I lay there, rigid and trembling, listening to the deafening silence, until exhaustion finally claimed me. In the morning, I told the others what I had seen. Sarah paled, and Jake's confident facade cracked as he admitted he, too, had heard noises in the night, soft whispers outside his door that he had been too afraid to investigate. We decided then and there to leave. The vacation wasn't worth the growing sense of dread that clung to us like a second skin. As we packed the car, I glanced back at the cabin one last time. In the upstairs window, I thought I saw a pale face staring out at us, watching as we fled. I blinked, and it was gone. Maybe it had never been there at all. Maybe it was just my exhausted mind playing tricks. But as we drove away, the oppressive weight that had followed us since the first night began to lift, replaced by a fragile relief. Even now, I sometimes dream of that tapping sound and the shadowy figure outside the window. I wonder if it's still there, waiting in the woods for someone else to stumble across its domain. Some part of me hopes I'll never find out. Story 9. The night shift at the hospital had always felt different from the day. During daylight hours, the building hummed with activity, doctors and nurses bustling through the halls, patients' families crowding waiting rooms, and the constant rhythm of monitors beeping in patient rooms. But at night, everything slowed to a hush. The hallways, lit by a dim glow from overhead lights, stretched on like endless tunnels, and the air seemed thicker somehow, as if the walls themselves held their breath. As a new nurse assigned to the graveyard shift, I told myself it was only natural to feel uneasy in such an environment. But nothing could have prepared me for the night I encountered her. It started quietly enough. Most of my patients were asleep, and I spent the early hours updating charts and making rounds. Around 3:15 a.m., I was stationed at the nurse's desk, sipping lukewarm coffee and listening to the faint hum of a floor buffer somewhere down the hall. That's when I heard it. A soft humming, melodic and strangely soothing, coming from one of the patient rooms. At first I assumed it was a family member keeping vigil, but as I checked the log, I realized none of my patients had visitors at this hour. Curious and a little concerned, I walked toward the sound. The humming grew clearer as I approached room 212, where an elderly woman named Mrs. Taylor was recovering from hip surgery. Pushing the door open gently, I peered inside. The room was dark except for the faint blue glow of the monitor by her bed, its steady beeps echoing in the stillness. Mrs. Taylor was asleep, her chest rising and falling in a calm rhythm. But seated in the chair by the window was a woman in a pale grey dress, her back to me, her long dark hair cascading over her shoulders. "Excuse me, visiting hours are over," I said softly, stepping into the room. The humming stopped abruptly. The woman didn't move. A chill crept up my spine as I waited for her to turn and acknowledge me, but she remained perfectly still. "Mom?" I called again, my voice firmer this time. Slowly the woman began to rise from the chair. Her movements were fluid, almost unnatural, as if she were gliding rather than standing. She turned toward me, and in the faint light I caught a glimpse of her face, or rather, the absence of one. Where her features should have been, there was only smooth, pale skin, blank and featureless. My breath caught in my throat, as icy terror rooted me to the spot. The faceless woman tilted her head slightly, as though regarding me with invisible eyes, and then she simply dissolved. Her form unravelled like mist in the morning sun, vanishing into the shadows. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my flashlight as I fumbled for the door. Bursting out into the hallway, I leaned against the wall, my heart pounding so fiercely I thought it might break through my ribs. The air felt heavy, oppressive, and every shadow seemed alive with unseen movement. I forced myself to breathe, to think. Had I imagined it? Was it exhaustion playing tricks on my mind? Gathering what little courage I had left, I called for security and explained what I had seen. They searched the entire floor but found nothing, no sign of a visitor, no disturbance in room 212. Mrs. Taylor slept peacefully, unaware of the terror that had unfolded only feet from her bed. The security guards exchanged skeptical glances, and I couldn't blame them. I wasn't sure I believed it myself. The rest of the shift crawled by painfully slow. Every creak of the building, every flicker of the fluorescent light set my nerves on edge. When dawn finally broke and the day staff began arriving, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief, as though I had emerged from a nightmare. But the memory lingered like a splinter in my mind, impossible to ignore. Over the next few weeks, I heard whispers from other staff members about room 212. Some spoke of strange cold spots, others of hearing soft humming late at night. A few claimed to have seen a woman in grey drifting through the hallways, always vanishing before they could approach. The stories varied, but they all shared one detail: the woman's face, or lack thereof. Now, whenever I walk the night shift, I avoid room 212 as much as possible. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I swear I can hear faint humming drifting down the hallway. And though I tell myself not to look, a part of me can't help but glance toward the doorway, half expecting to see a pale grey figure standing there, silently watching me, with a face as blank as the void. Story 10. I had always loved camping. There was something liberating about leaving behind the noise of the city and trading it for the quiet whispers of the forest, the crackle of a campfire, and the infinite stars scattered across the night sky. So when my friend Alex suggested a weekend camping trip in a remote national park, I didn't hesitate. We packed our gear, loaded up the car, and drove for hours until the winding road dissolved into a narrow dirt path. By the time we reached the site, the sun was setting, its golden light filtering through the dense canopy of trees. It was perfect. secluded, serene, and completely cut off from civilization. We set up our tents near a small clearing beside a trickling stream. As night fell, we cooked over an open fire and laughed as we recounted old stories. The air was cool and fresh, carrying the earthy scent of pine needles and damp moss. I remember thinking how peaceful it felt, how the silence of the forest wrapped around us like a warm blanket. By midnight, the fire died down to glowing embers, and sleep tugged at our eyelids. We retreated to our tents, lulled by the gentle chorus of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. I awoke suddenly in the middle of the night, my eyes snapping open to pitch-black darkness. At first, I wasn't sure what had roused me. The forest outside was silent now, too silent. Not even the wind stirred the branches. My pulse quickened as I strained my ears, listening for any sound. That's when I heard it, a faint whisper, so soft it was almost carried away by the still air. I held my breath, trying to make sense of it. The whisper came again, clearer this time. It was a voice, low and hoarse, murmuring words I couldn't understand. Goosebumps prickled across my skin as I realized the sound was coming from just outside my tent. Slowly, I reached for the flashlight beside my sleeping bag and clicked it on. The thin beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the nylon walls of the tent. The whispering stopped abruptly. Silence pressed in from all sides, heavy and suffocating. I waited, barely daring to breathe, my heart pounding in my ears. Then I saw a shadow move across the side of the tent, slow, deliberate, as if someone was circling it. Panic surged through me. I fumbled for my phone, but there was no signal, only the cold glow of the screen reflecting my wide-eyed terror. I considered calling out for Alex, but fear kept my voice trapped in my throat. Instead, I gripped the flashlight tighter and listened as the soft crunch of footsteps moved around the tent, pausing near the entrance. The zipper rattled slightly, as if tugged gently from the outside. My entire body went rigid. "Who's there?" I finally managed to choke out, my voice trembling. There was no reply, only the sound of breathing, slow, deep, and unnervingly steady. The zipper shifted again, this time with more force, and I thought for a horrifying moment that it was about to open. But then, just as suddenly as it began, the presence withdrew. The footsteps retreated, fading into the distance until they were swallowed by the silence. I sat frozen for what felt like hours, gripping the flashlight until my knuckles ached. At some point, exhaustion overtook fear, and I drifted into a restless sleep. When morning came, sunlight streamed through the thin fabric of the tent, chasing away the lingering shadows of the night. I stumbled outside to find Alex crouched by the fire pit, boiling water for coffee. "You okay?" he asked, noticing my pale face. "Didn't sleep well." I hesitated, debating whether to tell him. But as I glanced down, my breath caught in my throat. In the soft earth just beyond my tent, a set of footprints circled the perimeter, large, bare footprints that didn't belong to either of us. We packed up and left within the hour, neither of us speaking much during the drive home. Even now, years later, I can still hear that whisper sometimes in my dreams. Low, hoarse, and too close for comfort. And every time I do, I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't locked the zipper shut. Story 11. The drive through the countryside had been long and uneventful, the kind of road that seemed to stretch on forever, winding between endless fields and clusters of trees. I was heading to visit my grandmother in her small rural town, a place I hadn't been in years. It was late afternoon when I passed a weathered wooden sign on the side of the road. The paint was faded, but I could still make out the words. Maple Hollow, 2 miles ahead. The name didn't sound familiar. Curious, I slowed the car and turned down the narrow dirt road that led toward it. At first, the path seemed like any other back road, flanked by tall grass and occasional farmhouses with peeling paint and empty porches. But as I drove deeper, the air seemed to change. It grew heavier somehow, and the sunlight dimmed, even though there were no clouds in the sky. The trees leaned in closer, their branches arching overhead until they formed a tunnel that blocked much of the light. A strange chill worked its way into the car despite the warm day, and I reached to turn up the heat. That's when I noticed the silence. There were no birds singing, no rustle of leaves in the breeze, just the crunch of my tires over gravel and the faint hum of the engine. Something about the stillness prickled at the back of my neck, urging me to turn around. But I didn't. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe just stubbornness, but I kept going. A few minutes later, I saw it. A cluster of houses arranged around a small square. Maple Hollow. At first glance, it looked like any other sleepy town, but as I pulled into the square, my unease deepened. The buildings, though well maintained, seemed too still, too pristine, as if they were part of a set rather than a real place. I parked the car and stepped out, my shoes crunching softly on the gravel. "Hello," I called, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet. There was no answer. I wandered cautiously toward what appeared to be a general store. Its windows were clean and the door stood ajar as if inviting me in. Inside, the shelves were fully stocked, bread, canned goods, even fresh produce, but there was no one behind the counter, no customers browsing the aisles. The air smelled faintly of lavender and dust. A bell above the door jingled softly as I moved, though there was no breeze to stir it. "Is anyone here?" I called again, my voice catching slightly. Still nothing. I turned to leave, but froze when I caught movement in the corner of my eye. A figure stood across the square, perfectly still. It was a woman in a long, pale dress, her face obscured by the brim of a wide hat. Relief and apprehension warred within me. I wasn't alone, but something about her rigid posture made my stomach knot. I raised a hand in greeting. "Hi, I'm sorry to bother you, but..." The words died in my throat as the woman slowly lifted her head. Her face was pale, her features sharp and expressionless, and her eyes were entirely black, like pools of ink that swallowed the light. A chill shot down my spine as she tilted her head slightly, as though studying me. And then she moved, not walking, but gliding silently across the ground toward me. My instincts screamed at me to run. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the threshold of the store. When I looked again, she was gone. The square stood empty, as still and silent as before. Heart hammering, I sprinted to my car and fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, and I slammed the car into reverse, tires spinning in the gravel as I fled the square. In the rearview mirror, I thought I caught a glimpse of the woman standing in the middle of the road, her black eyes fixed on me. But when I blinked, the road behind me was empty. It wasn't until I reached the main highway that I allowed myself to breathe. I never told my grandmother about Maple Hollow. A few weeks later, I tried to look it up on a map, but no such town existed, and yet sometimes when I drive alone on back roads, I find myself scanning for that weathered wooden sign, half expecting it to reappear. Part of me hopes it never does. Story 12. When I first moved into the apartment, it felt like a dream come true. It was a small but cozy place on the top floor of an old brick building downtown, with tall windows that bathed the rooms in soft golden light during the day. The price was surprisingly affordable, and the landlord seemed eager to have someone move in. "It's been empty for a while," he said casually as he handed me the keys. "You'll find it nice and quiet up there." At the time, I didn't think much of it. I was just excited to finally have a space of my own. The first few nights passed uneventfully. I unpacked boxes, arranged furniture, and settled into a new routine. I loved the creaky wooden floors and the faint scent of old books that seemed to linger in the air. But by the end of the first week, I began to notice things. It started with small noises at night, soft thumps from the corner of the living room, or faint footsteps above me. Except there was no apartment above mine. The building's top floor was mine alone, and the roof lay just beyond the ceiling. First I brushed it off as the house settling or sounds carrying through the old walls, but the noises grew louder, more deliberate. One night, as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard the sound of furniture scraping across the living room floor. My eyes snapped open, heart pounding as I listened. The sound continued for several seconds before stopping abruptly. I grabbed the heaviest object I could find, a brass candlestick, and tiptoed into the living room, but the room was empty. Everything sat exactly where I had left it. The next morning, I found something that chilled me to the bone. On the kitchen table lay an old, yellowed photograph I didn't recognize. It showed a woman in the apartment, standing near the window. Her features were blurred, but her posture was rigid, her head tilted slightly as if she were listening for something. I searched through my unpacked boxes, wondering if it had somehow fallen out of an old book, but it didn't belong to me. A few days later, I woke to the sound of whispering. It was faint, but distinct. Words I couldn't quite make out. It seemed to come from the corner of my bedroom, where shadows pooled even in the dim glow of my bedside lamp. I lay frozen, clutching the blanket tightly around me, too afraid to move. The whispers stopped suddenly, replaced by a low, drawn-out sigh. The next morning I spoke to my landlord. "Have there been incidents here?" I asked cautiously. He hesitated before answering. "It's an old building," he said finally. "Sometimes they make strange noises. You'll get used to it." But I saw something in his eyes, something like guilt or fear, and I knew he wasn't telling me everything. That night, I decided I couldn't stay in the apartment any longer. I packed a bag and planned to leave first thing in the morning. As I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I heard it again. The scraping of furniture, the muffled footsteps. And then, slowly, my bedroom door creaked open. A cold draft swept into the room and I saw her. The woman from the photograph stood in the doorway, her blurred face turned toward me. Her movements were slow, almost hesitant, as she stepped into the room. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't respond. She stopped at the foot of my bed, her head tilting slightly, as if listening to my pounding heart. When I woke the next morning, I was alone. The apartment was silent, sunlight streaming innocently through the tall windows. But I didn't stay long enough to question what had happened. I grabbed my bag and left the keys on the counter. As I shut the door behind me, I felt her eyes on my back, watching me leave. I never returned, and to this day, I still wonder if the next tenant heard the whispers too.